Washington is suddenly pulling for Ukraine and it's already hitting the Kremlin. Trump is increasingly taking Ukraine's side and Moscow is already talking about panic. Western media are sounding the alarm. The US perspective on the war is shifting, and Washington's role as a neutral mediator is effectively crumbling. But most importantly, Trump is shocked by Ukraine's strikes on Russia and now openly acknowledges its strength on the battlefield. Is this a real shift by the US in favor of Kyiv? And why can't the Kremlin hide its nerves anymore? I'll share all the details in just a moment. Hello? This is Ukraine Today. I'm Solomia Dolik with the latest events. Trump is shocked by Ukraine's successes. There's panic in the Kremlin. Washington is suddenly pulling for Kyiv. The global political map is shuddering once again. According to the Financial Times, the Kremlin is seeing what it seemingly feared most, a new shift by Washington toward Ukraine. And this shift, according to Russian officials, is already causing blatant irritation and a nervous reaction in Moscow. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated that the United States has allegedly begun to step away from the role of an objective mediator and is no longer acting in the format the Kremlin is used to.
The US is allegedly retreating from the role of an objective mediator.
Lavrov also added that Moscow believes Washington is changing its approach to the war. But something else caused a real shock in the Kremlin. According to the Financial Times, during the G7 summit, Donald Trump was extremely impressed and fascinated by the results of Ukrainian long-range strikes on targets deep inside Russian territory. Effectively, what was previously perceived cautiously in Washington is now eliciting a completely different reaction. And that's not all. At the same summit, according to sources, Trump agreed to tighten sanctions against the Russian energy sector, a move that Moscow is already calling extremely sensitive. Meanwhile, the Kremlin has begun to admit that hopes for the US's role as an honest mediator are effectively fading. Lavrov stated directly that Moscow no longer expects Washington to play this role. And while Russia is nervous, an even more significant shift is taking place in the US. According to the Financial Times, Washington's assessment of the war is gradually changing. While some officials previously believed Russia had the upper hand, doubts are now increasingly being raised about its actual ability to achieve its stated goals. And this is where a key detail emerges that has shocked many. Senior Ukrainian officials are reporting cautious but clear optimism about increased support from the US. This refers to the possible supply of Patriot interceptor missiles and even the launch of their licensed production in Europe and Ukraine. According to a Ukrainian official, during dinner, Trump told Volodymyr Zelensky directly that he was impressed by Ukraine's recent military results. And after the meeting, Zelensky stated that for the first time, the American side responded positively to the possibility of licensing missiles for Patriot systems. Ultimately, the situation looks like a sharp geopolitical shift. European allies are already saying that Washington's change in rhetoric could open a new phase of support for Ukraine and increased pressure on Moscow. And if these trends truly take hold, it could mean one thing: the game around Ukraine is entering a new, much tougher stage where the US no longer looks like an observer. We'll keep watching. And it seems the most interesting part is just beginning. Lately, Donald Trump has increasingly been publicly acknowledging Ukraine's ability to hold back the Russian offensive. A statement was made in the US that is already actively spreading through global media and sparking new discussions about Russia's war against Ukraine. United States President Donald Trump publicly acknowledged that the Ukrainian military is showing resilience on the front and continues to hold back a much more powerful adversary. The American president emphasized that despite Russia's numerical advantage, the situation on the battlefield does not look as clear-cut as it was often presented before.
Russia is a big country with huge, as you know, much larger armed forces. But the Ukrainians, are doing quite well. They're holding on.
According to Trump, the Ukrainian army has serious support in the form of modern weaponry, particularly of American manufacture. Separately, Trump noted the overall combat capability of Ukrainian forces, stating that they are doing quite well in the conditions of a full-scale war. In fact, this statement became another signal that Washington is increasingly publicly acknowledging Ukraine's ability to hold the front despite massive pressure from Russia. And this is happening against the backdrop of Donald Trump increasingly speaking about Ukraine in a more positive and cautiously supportive tone, recognizing its ability to resist the Russian offensive. breaking a powerful breakthrough in Berlin. NATO is openly talking about a Ukrainian victory. The Kremlin is trapped in its own illusions. Alliance Secretary General Mark Rutte firmly states Russia is not achieving its goals on the battlefield. Bring this sensational news: $60 billion in military aid to Ukraine in 2025. This is only the beginning. Ukrainian cities are protected by modern air defense. Drones and long-range munitions are already in action. The US is in the crosshairs of a diplomatic game. Rutte is pursuing a subtle strategy with Trump, a complex balance of rhetoric and strategic interests. Personal diplomacy is saving Ukraine. The main goal remains unchanged: Ukraine's victory and deterring the aggressor. The first shocking details are coming up next. NATO now speaks without hesitation about Ukraine's victory and is even securing an advantage for Kyiv with its own hands. Following another meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group in the Ramstein format, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte made a clear statement: the Kremlin is not achieving its goals on the battlefield. Speaking at a press conference in Berlin, he emphasized that Russian troops are facing serious difficulties. Despite constant pressure and offensive attempts, the occupying army is showing no strategic success. However, according to Rutte, allies must continue to strengthen support for Ukraine as the war continues non-stop and leaves no room for pauses. We cannot lose sight of Ukraine, emphasized the NATO Secretary General, as the world simultaneously faces a number of other security challenges. But Russian aggression remains one of the key threats to European stability. He specifically noted that Russia continues massive attacks, striking Ukrainian cities and infrastructure virtually around the clock, both day and night. That is why the issue of supporting Ukraine remains at the forefront of the international agenda. During the Ramstein format meeting, allies reaffirmed their financial commitments. In 2025, Ukraine was promised approximately $60 billion in military aid. It is not just about the volume, but also the quality of support. Among the main priorities is strengthening air defense systems, which allow for the protection of Ukrainian cities from missile and drone attacks. Also in focus is the development of drone technologies, which are playing an increasingly important role on the modern battlefield. A special emphasis is on the supply of long-range munitions, which enable Ukrainian forces to strike targets in the enemy's rear and weaken its military potential. NATO emphasizes that supporting Ukraine is not just a matter of solidarity, but an investment in the security of all of Europe. And as long as the war continues, allies are determined to maintain unity and continue assistance for as long as it takes. However, behind the scenes of diplomacy, the situation looks much more complicated. According to Politico, citing insiders, Mark Rutte is forced to play a delicate political game in his relationship with United States President Donald Trump. It is not just about diplomacy, but about maintaining key support for Ukraine from the United States. According to sources, the NATO Secretary General deliberately uses soft rhetoric and even public compliments toward the American leader. And he does this with one goal: to prevent the scaling back of military aid to Ukraine. Within the alliance, such steps have sparked a mixed reaction. Earlier, Western media reported dissatisfaction among some NATO allies regarding Rutte's complimentary statements about Trump's decisions. However, as insiders explain, this strategy is based on a clear calculation. NATO's ability to help Ukraine directly depends on Washington's position and therefore on how effectively the Secretary General can find common ground with Donald Trump.
If this means that the United States will continue to supply weapons and share intelligence, then such a tactic is justified.
In fact, it is about a complex balance between political rhetoric and strategic interests. Mark Rutte himself, according to sources, believes that even public flattery is a small price to pay if it helps maintain support for Ukraine in the war. After all, the key goal remains unchanged: to ensure the conditions for Ukraine's victory and to deter further Russian aggression. And the main logic, as explained by sources citing Politico,
the focus is on what is best for Ukraine. If this means that the United States will continue to sell weapons to Ukraine and share intelligence, he is making the right decisions.
Diplomacy on the edge of psychology. According to this logic, Rutte's key goal is not confrontation, but keeping the United States in the system of support for Ukraine through personal contact with Trump. Insiders describe this as a pragmatic approach: less pressure, more personal communication, and maintaining Ukraine's access to weaponry and intelligence. Ukraine is at the center of the whole game. The article emphasizes that for the NATO Secretary General, the main thing is precisely the result for Ukraine.
This takes off some of the pressure. And if this means continued support for Ukraine, it is the right decision.
Who really wins in this game? In parallel, Western political circles are discussing the broader context, the role of the United States in the war, European unity, and the stability of arms supplies to Ukraine. And against this backdrop, another important emphasis emerges. Public support for Ukraine in the United States and Europe remains significant despite political controversies. What does this actually mean? In fact, it is about a complex diplomatic system. NATO is trying to maintain unity using personal channels of influence, and the main goal is not to lose support for Ukraine. And the main question, can personal diplomacy become a key factor in deciding the fate of military aid to Ukraine? The answer, it seems, is being formed right now in the corridors of NATO and Washington. Let us recall that all this happened after a scandalous meeting. Trump exploded against NATO. Loud accusations and hints of revenge. United States President Donald Trump sharply criticized NATO allies during a closed-door meeting. His interlocutor was the alliance's Secretary General Mark Rutte, and what was supposed to be routine negotiations turned into a real political explosion. According to sources, the atmosphere was extremely tense.
It went sideways. The conversation was nothing but a tirade of insults.
Moreover, according to insiders, Trump likely threatened to do whatever it takes. The main grievance is Iran. The cause of resentment is Europe's lack of support for the United States in the Iran conflict. Trump made it clear the allies failed to meet expectations and there could be consequences. According to sources, he is even considering retaliatory options, wants concrete actions from partners, and insists on the swift reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. However, a White House spokesperson stated that the president made no demands of the alliance in his talk with Rutte. After the meeting, a public outburst on social media, Trump did not hold back.
NATO simply was not there when we truly needed them. And it is likely they will not be there if we ever need them again. Remember Greenland? That big, poorly managed chunk of ice? None of these people understood a thing until pressure was applied to them.
But NATO is responding? Alliance spokesperson Alison Hart categorically disagrees with the negative assessments. She stated, "The meeting was very candid and at the same time constructive." But can a conversation where threats are made be called constructive? The negotiation game between Washington and Moscow is entering a new phase. The United States is increasingly putting Russia in a position of choice where any decision has political consequences. Trump is actively pushing his own agenda, and the Kremlin is forced to react. Is the balance of influence between the White House and Moscow truly shifting? More on all this next.
Trump is drawing Putin into negotiations in the United States, and this could be a trap the Kremlin can't escape. Donald Trump supports the idea of a trilateral meeting involving Zelensky, Putin, and the United States on American soil. The idea is simple and tough. Either Putin sits at the negotiating table under pressure from Washington, or he openly shows the world he's fleeing from dialogue. The Kremlin finds itself in a dead end. Previously, they easily invented excuses: wrong format, wrong venue, wrong time. But now everything is different. When the United States and Trump personally are the initiators, any refusal looks like a political escape. Zelensky is directly ramping up this pressure. A format in the United States under Trump's leadership is no longer just negotiations. It is a public stage for the entire world. Agree, and you'll have to answer for the war directly. Refuse, and the escape becomes obvious to everyone. If Moscow refuses this chance too, the conversation could move to another level, the level of additional pressure. And then for the Kremlin, the problem won't be the meeting location or the negotiation format anymore. Then they'll have to answer for their unwillingness to find a way out of a war that is costing Russia more and more. And that is a completely different level of discomfort.
For years, the Kremlin has built an image of a strong geopolitical player who dictates terms to others. But now, the situation risks turning into a political joke. Every time a chance to sit at the negotiating table arises, the Russian side finds a new reason to stay as far away as possible. And the more often this happens, the louder the world asks, who is actually afraid of negotiations? Especially since this is far from the first attempt to bring the Kremlin to the negotiating table. Earlier, Volodymyr Zelensky proposed a meeting with Putin at the G7 summit involving the world's leading democratic nations. For someone who's spent years talking about readiness for peace and dialogue, this was a great chance to prove it, but the result was predictable. The Russian leader refused to participate. As soon as a real platform for negotiations appears, the Kremlin immediately finds new reasons not to show up. First, the reluctance to meet with Zelensky, then the lack of interest in the G7 format. Now a new proposal is on the table, a meeting in the USA involving Donald Trump. And it increasingly seems that the problem for Moscow isn't the location or even the format of the talks. After all, the longer this diplomatic game of hide-and-seek lasts, the louder the uncomfortable question becomes. If the Kremlin truly wants peace, why does its leader so persistently avoid a face-to-face talk? A man who loves to project the image of a fearless geopolitical player hasn't found time for years for a meeting that's supposed to end the war. And if Putin also rejects the American format promoted by Zelensky and Trump, making excuses will become much harder, because sooner or later the world may conclude that it's not Kyiv or the West fleeing talks, as the record holder for avoiding peace meetings sits in the Kremlin. Earlier, Zelensky used a very direct diplomatic signal to Putin, an open letter proposing to end the war and hold a personal meeting. This wasn't just a political gesture, but an attempt to issue a direct challenge, either dialogue or a clear sign of the Kremlin's refusal to talk. A specific emphasis was placed on the fact that Ukraine doesn't want an endless war and sees a real chance to end it. Zelensky stated that most Russians might also support ending the war, and rejecting this path is a deliberate escalation far beyond the Kremlin's initial plans. In fact, it was a call to exit the war that sounded like a political warning. Importantly, the format of the talks in this letter was immediately moved beyond the borders of Ukraine and Russia. Neutral countries were suggested as venues, specifically Switzerland, Turkey, or Middle Eastern nations. Ukraine also stated its readiness, if a real dialogue occurs, to consider a temporary ceasefire and involve the US and Europe. Thus, this letter became another stage of diplomatic pressure, an attempt to move the war from the battlefield to direct political responsibility. And if new negotiation formats involving the US are being discussed today, then this step looks like a preliminary signal. Kyiv is consistently trying to pull the Kremlin into a direct dialogue, shifting the level and scale of pressure. We can't ignore the story of Roman Abramovich, who secretly visited Zelensky for closed-door negotiations. The irony is that back channels sometimes prove to be more active than official ones. And while Russian TV talks about a monolithic power structure, in reality, it's long resembled a web of loose cables searching for a connection just to stay powered up. And among these cables, people from the inner circle of the Russian elite suddenly emerge, preferring to speak not through the Kremlin but around it. The situation is quite ironic. Officially, no negotiations, no concessions. We dictate the terms. Unofficially, business intermediaries are quietly knocking on doors, looking for even a small window for a deal. The topic of negotiations has long moved beyond standard diplomacy, becoming a political test of accountability. The US, through a potential format involving Trump, is effectively raising the stakes to the limit. Either Putin joins a public talk about the war, or the world sees his refusal as a deliberate avoidance of dialogue. Against this backdrop, every new initiative from the G7 to the American platform narrows the room for maneuver, leaving the Kremlin with fewer neutral phrases and more awkward, unanswered questions. And what do you think about these events? Share your thoughts in the comments, like the video, and stay up to date with the latest news. More to come. So, see you in the next report.